Light-hearted stuff there from Angela Eagle. But after a busy spell of conferences and reshuffles, what changes are we really going to see? I gathered together three avid Westminster watchers. Charlotte Henry, a Liberal Democrat who writes the blog Digital Politico. Paul Richards, a Labour campaigner, author, tweeter and blogger. And from the right, Raheem Kassam, the editor of the blog and website Trending Central. I asked Charlotte Henry if she thought Nick Clegg's conference speech, holding open the door for another coalition government, would go down well with voters.
I think Clegg has re-put that sort of equidistant between the two parties. I think that's what the whole aim of the speech was. He didn't want to be seen to only be able to work with the Conservatives. He didn't want to say, now we have to work with Labour. I think he's really returned to that theme of equidistance as we lead into the last bit towards the general election.
But won't voters think that you are just opportunist?
Well, they might, but I think that would be highly inaccurate. I mean, they pick who goes into voters pick. We all pick when we go and vote how many seats and votes each party gets. So that's what it comes down to. It's not Nick Clegg, Ed Miliband, or David Cameron deciding the government.
All right. Paul Richards, there had been a call for a long time for Ed Miliband to come up with some policies to actually say something. Now, that is something that he did in his conference speech, but at the same time, that's instantly provided a stick for the Conservatives to beat him with.
I think if you take the three leaders' speeches, it's hard to remember anything from any of them apart from the fuel freeze, which then did capture the public imagination and is still part of the debate going forward into this Parliament. So that was a proper policy. Of course, it will be attacked, but increasingly the Tories don't know quite how to attack it, and it is it's breaking through to the public, more importantly.
But David Cameron at Prime Minister's Questions this week has already described it as Marxist. I mean, it's going to play right into his hands.
If that's the level of your response to a fairly sensible idea which resonates with many people struggling with bills, then great. You know, if that's the level of the debate he wants to have. The public are saying, yes, our bills are too much. What are you going to do about it? And only Ed Miliband has got the response to that.
Isn't this a point? I mean, David Cameron in his conference speech didn't say anything at all.
Yes, I think that's probably about right. The one thing I can remember from David Cameron's speech is Land of Hope and Tory, which isn't necessarily the best talking point for the general public to pick up on. But I think it was a speech for the grassroots. It was a speech for the base. It wasn't a speech for the public. The general perception of David Cameron's approach to the conference has been positive from all the people I've spoken to. One of the things that Paul mentioned was Ed's speech about energy prices and things like that. You said it as a stick to beat him with. I think it very much is, because we've got these quotes from Ed now that came out yesterday from only just 2 years ago, where he said fuel prices have to rise, energy prices have to rise, because we've got to, tackle this great Goliath of climate change that is or is not occurring. And I think the Tories are going to keep hitting him with that stick for a very long time, and I don't think the public's going to buy it.
Let's move on from there. Since we've all got back to Westminster, things have moved on even from there. So we've now had reshuffles. Charlotte, I have to come to you. The Liberal Democrats made the most interesting moves. We've got to start with Norman Baker. Now, this is a man who wrote a book suggesting there'd been a cover-up about the death of Dr. David Kelly. He's now been put in the Home Office. Most people thought that was, to say the least, surprising.
I did find it very odd that Norman Baker did take that seat because, I can understand Nick Clegg wanting to sort of imprint liberalism on the Home Office, have someone to counteract Theresa May. But actually, I think all this has done is sort of inflame the tension within the Home Office more, instead of having someone that can maybe
softly.
Exactly. Someone who can act as a conciliatory liberal influence, which I think a Duncan Hames might well have done.
Raheem, what do you think the Conservatives are going to make of the Norman Baker appointment then?
Yeah, inflammatory, I think, is a good word to describe sort of, pushing this conspiracy theorist, foisting him upon the Home Secretary.
Crime prevention.
I think Charlotte's entirely right in her analysis that actually you needed someone who could pull Theresa May a little bit more to the Liberal side of the spectrum, softly, gently, rather than actually presenting her with a very stark opposite number or whatever you would call it inside the Home Office. But part of me wants to believe that there is some sort of calculation about this vis-a-vis the immigration vans and things like that we've discussed in recent months. That is to say that they needed somebody in there who wasn't going to be afraid to just speak their mind and with a stream of consciousness about these issues. If there's something you can say about Baker, then it's certainly that he will speak his mind. It may not be.
The problem is, though, if you're a minister with those views in that department, the officials will simply freeze you out.
Sure.
So you can speak your mind all you like, but if you can't pull the levers of power, because the very officials who are supposed to be working for you are the ones you've accused of covering up an Iraqi hit squad operating in Oxfordshire, then you become frozen out. You're a lame duck minister from the start. That's the problem.
Let's not stay on this for too long. I mean, Ed Miliband also reshuffled his team. Much speculation about the booting out of Blairites and whether this was the end of New Labour and all that kind of stuff. But what do you think the job is for Ed Miliband and the Labour Party for the remainder of this Parliament?
Well, he's put together a team which actually does contain those people that you might call Blairite. It's an increasingly irrelevant term 6 years after Blair left. But people like Liam Byrne are still there. Others that you thought might have been moved out of shadow cabinet altogether are still in the front bench. And he's obviously rewarded his own supporters. Well, which leader doesn't do that? But he has put together a balanced team. And this is the team now that will take us into the general election. So he's on a war footing now. He's putting together the people he thinks can reach out to those voters we need to win.
I mean, the Blairites, whatever we want to call them, the Jim Murphys, the Liam Byrnes, the Douglas Alexanders, whatever way you may try and spin it, those guys who are big hitters in the Labour movement have had their wings severely clipped on the front bench. They might still nominally be on the front bench, but I mean,
I don't think
I
don't think being shadow diffid is getting your wings clipped. That's a very important job.
Rather irrelevant ministerial post anyway, and shadowing diffid's even worse, quite frankly.
Solving world poverty is not a minor role, is it? It's quite an important job.
But it means you're out of the country a considerable amount of time.
Well, let's come back to the stuff that really matters. Labour needs, the long and the short of it, to pick up more votes. Where's it going to get more votes from?
Well, the tactic is very much now this sort of bread and butter, cost of living, practical policies. I think Ed has taken on board some of the criticism that he was a bit wonkish, that some of the language around pre-distribution didn't mean anything to anybody. And now he's back on very, tough talking stuff around energy bills and so on, which people can actually get hold of and understand. And so you'll hear a lot more of this over the next 2 years now. Very practical Ed, talking about things that matter to people.
Now, David Cameron also reshuffled his pack. Much talk of flat caps and ethnic minorities and women and all those kind of things. I mean, really, what's he trying to do with the reshuffle that he's had? And is, in any part, this an attempt to sort of see off UKIP and shore up support in the north?
Yeah, I think so. It was very well done, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of a PR rollout of this new cabinet. And I think what you're saying about trapping votes in the north and with ethnic minority voters was a calculation in that as well. The appointment of Sajid Javid to the Treasury, I think, is a phenomenal move, which will only further embolden George Osborne. It's very much seen as George Osborne's reshuffle rather than David Cameron's reshuffle. And I think that's a positive thing, because I view George Osborne as a much more serious, calculating Conservative figure than David Cameron is. And I think this will play to the Conservative Party's strengths over the next...
You're quite keen on the idea that the Conservative Party could, in some instances, hook up with UKIP. Isn't that going to lose you a whole chunk of voters and all the people who are in the centre of your party?
Well, you're going to allow me to plug a new initiative that a few of us are starting called Unite the Right, which is very much how UKIP and the Conservatives can help each other keep Ed Miliband out. It's not so much uniting the two parties, but actually tactically voting to make sure that we don't have a Marxist in power after the next election.
It's unlikely we're going to have a Marxist in power.
Oh, I don't know.
Wins the election.
I don't know.
All right, I'm going to finish by asking you all the same question. So, Charlotte, let's start with you. What is your party's Achilles heel? What is the hole that it mustn't fall into in the remainder of this Parliament?
I think, actually, we've got to be very, very careful that as the economy turns round, we don't let the Conservatives get the credit by seeming to have been opposed to some of the more difficult things. I think it's, on welfare reform, which we've seen polling coming out that is hugely popular in the public, and, further cuts which help balance the books. I think if we're going to take credit for the economic turnaround, we must be very careful that we actually front up to the difficult things that that's entailed.
All right, Paul Richards, what's the huge hole that your party mustn't fall into?
I think, in a word, it's complacency. Because Labour is ahead in the opinion polls and ahead in the marginals even further, there's a suggestion that just keep your head down, don't say anything radical, hope for the best, and sneak in somehow across the finishing line. And that's catastrophic for Labour. Labour has to remain a radical reforming party, public service reform, welfare reform. We've got to have something to say about that.
And is it the same danger for you that, above all, the Conservative Party mustn't appear complacent?
No, I don't think that's quite correct. I think the Conservative Party now must make great efforts to reach out to the people who have defected to UKIP. I think there are a lot of them, and the numbers are growing, and they are really hemorrhaging votes, and we're going to see that at the European elections next year. But also the Conservatives, I think, really need to start beating the left with this socialist stick harder and harder, because actually what Ed Miliband is doing is pulling the Labour Party further and further to the left and getting away with it. I don't think Tony Blair would have allowed, something like that to happen under him, and we certainly know that he wouldn't have stood for that. You say the term Blairite is no longer relevant. Well, I would contest that it will be as relevant in the future as the term Bevanite still is today. And so I think that we need to start showing that the Labour Party should no longer be a party of the far left.
All right, well, we should look forward to a very interesting 15 or so months. Thank you all very much for coming in to see us. Now let's take a look at some of the other stories from around Westminster in brief. Shares in Royal Mail began trading, initially priced at